Hey, so hi everybody. This is Virginia Summy here, and thank you for joining us tonight with the Civil War Doc Happy Hour. Tonight, our guest is Scott Reynolds Nelson. He is a professor of history at the University of Georgia and focuses on 19th century U.S. history, including the history of slavery, international finance, and global commodities. His most recent book, I'll go and get it, Oceans of Grain, is about the US and Russian empires' competition to feed Europe between 1789, yes, and 1919. And so I'm going to turn it over to Scott and let him tell us all about his book, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Great. About how long do you want me to talk?
Yeah, however long you want to go,
Okay.
5 minutes. Yeah, just give us just let us know what the book's about.
Okay. All right. Oh, I'm not allowed to share my screen. I was just going to show a couple of images, but
I can make you the host. Hold on just a second.
Okay. So did you say just about 5 minutes?
5 to 10 minutes. That's fine. However,
okay.
You can go as long as you want.
Okay. All right. I'll just quickly go through. Awesome. Okay. Let me share screen. Let me pull it up. I just have some images. I wasn't allowed to use images in the book. I just maps, and so I'd like to kind of show you a couple of images of the stuff that I'm writing about. And so, all right. So generally, this is, in a way, this book is an attempt to put the U.S. Civil War in a kind of a different kind of international context, not just, international finance or something like that, but sort of what the U.S. is kind of up to in the 1860s and this sort of shift from cotton to grain and the larger background. And I started about 2800 BC in the book, so a little bit further than you'd ordinarily expect in a book. So let me just F5 this. Okay. All right, a little bit about grain itself. I'm going to talk about the general arc of the book, and then questions that lead to the sort of how we can understand it in the present. In Cuisine and Empire, Rachel Loudon says that grain appears in many places as a famine crop. So in much of China and Asia, and it's not as tasty as rice or millet or other grains, but number one, it's easy to grow, but there are two problems with it. It's not that easy to store. And in fact, the secret of long-term storage was lost in the world between 400 AD and 1820 AD. And it's difficult to be turned into food. It's kind of complicated. And the story of Demeter and her daughter Persephone, I want to suggest, is partly an extended metaphor for the many mysteries involved in storing wheat and turning it into food. So Demeter's slim-ankled daughter Persephone is snatched from the fields by Hades, king of the underworld, and shoved into the misty gloom where the narcissus flowers are blooming, which is late winter. And Persephone is trapped there and stays preserved, pining for her family, and she waits months for rescue despite her distress. Wheat kernels and seed balls can be preserved for many months in vitro without storing, that is either in growing into wheat plants or serving as a host for bacteria and yeast. And we now know that wheat kernels have to be lightly warmed, dried, stirred to keep the hot sections from forming fungi or bacteria. And wheat seeds, ironically, are very much like humans. They breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. But if moisture is kept out and the percentage of oxygen goes down, seeds go into a slumber, just like Persephone does, and goes into a daze. And it's in its sleeping Persephone-like form that seeds can keep its nutrients and germinal force for not just a few months, but for years, even 10 years. But that secret is part of the mysteries that are taught from parents to their children. It was taught in the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire as the kind of Eleusinian mysteries. It's taught in the Roman Empire, but it goes away around 400. And so from 400 to 1820, much of Europe, wheat seeds are exposed. They're put in a kind of crib. They get access to air, but they only last about a year. The story of Demeter and Persephone is also a story about how to make wheat into bread or mush. And so Persephone doffs her dark cloak. She looks for her daughter with fire, and that's how you take wheat and turn it into food. You take off the outer cloak of the grain, you bake it, and you mix it with water. Mix it with penny water is what she asked for, which is basically where you get your yeast. Water, yeast, and grain then puff up as microbes digest the grain. And when we eat bread, and we have this invisible process of saccharification, which no one understood in the ancient world, but was viewed as a kind of miracle. And at a microscopic level, two microbes digest the wheat's starch and cellulose and expel simple sugars. As the fungi breathe out carbon dioxide, the product rises. And this is then put in water and fed to children in the story of Persephone. So it's along these. So that's kind of the story of wheat and the story of Demeter and Persephone is about this sort of storage and delivery of this grain product. And this is Persephone. This is it's called the rape of Persephone. Persephone is stored underground by Hades. And this is on the right are the kind of grain storage devices that were used for wheat for hundreds of years, thousands of years, until around 400 AD, when the secret is more or less lost. And that's the magic in the Eleusinian mysteries, the mixture of wheat, water, and yeast. We now know, based on kind of scientific work that's been done very recently in Cell and Nature, that grain trading has gone on since at least 2800 BC. So basically almost 3,000 years before we thought grain trade started. And we know this because of Yersinia pestis, which is basically the plague or the ancestor of the plague. And it travels, as you can see in this map at the bottom, all the way from Sweden to Manchuria. And so there are these grain trading networks in 2800 BC, which is before empires, right? The city-state of Ur and these other things come after this. But we know that there's a grain trade because the bacteria that infest people, the plague, travels further than any human does, and you can trace human passage through what's called genetic drift. But humans don't move anywhere near this distance in 2800 BC. But food seems to, and grain and rats and other things like that that live with grain in packages of grain do seem to last. And so this story of kind of grain delivery, the center of it is in Ukraine on the Black Sea. And this has been the case for thousands of years. Trypillia in 2800 BC is a town built on bread and trade. And that's Trypillia. And what happens then is, as these grain trading what I suggest in the book is that as these grain trading networks emerge in the Neolithic period, we see a convergence of these trades thousands of years later, or not thousands, hundreds of years later. We see the emergence of empires right at the place where those grain trade takes place. And so it's places like Constantinople, places like Rome, and others where states emerge that store grain. And grain is basically produced by slaves. It's brought into the city center. It becomes the sort of basis of the city, and empires expand as they follow these grain routes. Now, the person that I learned this from was a guy named Parvis. I have been talking about grain delivery and grain, thinking about grain in terms of the Civil War and Reconstruction for a long time. But I realized relatively late in my life, I suppose, about 5 or 6 years ago, that I was actually inadvertently plagiarizing a communist intellectual who talked about the delivery of grain over very, very long distances, and their kind of basis in empire. This is Ukraine in the 15th century, and the lines that you see here, some of them are rivers, and the others are what are called the black paths, Chorny Shlaki, which are the routes by which grain travels to the Black Sea. Now, this is the north this is an upside down map. So the bottom of the map is the north, the top of the map is the south, and right at the very top is the Black Sea. And so from Poland all the way through Russia and Ukraine, you have these black paths of grain that are traveling, and they feed the Roman Empire. They feed the Greek empires before that. The story of Jason and the Argonauts, ancient historians have said that the golden fleece that they were searching for was actually wheat, that was actually grain. And Greece establishes these grain colonies along the Black Sea in what's now Ukraine, in the 6th and 5th and 4th centuries BC. And this is so it's a very, very long process, an international trade in grain that precedes empires and carries on and helps us understand kind of how empires form. So rather than thinking about the world as blobs on a map, the kingdom of Urartu, the Greek city-states, the Phrygian kingdom, Parvis, this person that I became interested in, sees the world as lines, those black paths that connect the world together, that connect Sweden to Manchuria, that connect, that pass through the Mediterranean, that connect major cities together. This is the Varangian corridor that connects the Baltic and the Black Sea. And again, this is an ancient corridor. And for him, those corridors help you explain everything. This is the person I'm talking about, Israel Helfand, born in 1867, so right after the Civil War, and a young man in 1873 in Odessa. And what he sees is, and this is, we're finally getting to the Civil War, is that Odessa had been feeding Europe for 100 years. It had been providing grain to Europe for 100 years. But then by 1873, Russia had been displaced by the United States during the Civil War, and that the world was being fed from the United States rather than from Odessa. And this led to major chaos in Russia, because this was one of the wealthiest parts of Russia, was this area in what's now Ukraine. And that wealth kind of went away, disappeared in 1872. And he calls it the agrarian crisis, and we call it the Panic of 1873, or the Great Depression of 1873. And he becomes a kind of fascinated by this transformation. This is the Cossacks, the people in Ukraine, and this is them writing a letter to Mehmed the Fourth in 1652 or something like that. This is drawn in 1880 or so. And Ukraine has been a place that's been producing grain, again, for thousands of years, but it's displaced by the United States during the Civil War. The plan to, the thing that makes Russia a great power is the Ukraine. It's Catherine II, let's see, starting in the 1450s, if not earlier, the Russian Empire had planned to build and expand across Europe, but it knew that it needed to control the Black Sea to do this. There have been many attempts by Peter the Great and others to seize Ukraine, but it's Catherine II who succeeds. She captures this in the 1790s, and she's a very different kind of intellectual and Tsarina, queen, I suppose, in this context, in that she's influenced by the physiocrats who also influence Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who believe that grain and food production is the center of the economy. And the physiocrats believe that if you sell grain to the other empires, that could make your empire great. So the United States and Europe are engaged, I argue, in a kind of international competition to feed Europe from the 1760s all the way up until the Civil War. And Catherine the Great basically steals a march on Russia. She does this by invading Ukraine, by colonizing it, by putting this map here, Odessa on the Black Sea in the center here is a very deep port. And it's from during the Napoleonic Wars, during the French Revolutionary Wars, European wheat fields are burning. Russia is feeding them. By the 1840s and 1850s, when the Irish potato famine comes, Russia is feeding the major cities of Europe. And it's really only in 1862 and 63 that the United States becomes a major competitor to Russia in that regard. Let me go, bear with me here for a second. Yeah, and so this is where Parvis is from, is Odessa, and watching from the docks, he sees this transformation take place. He sees the United States defeat Russia in this kind of international competition. Now, you might not have heard of Parvis. You probably, very likely, haven't ever heard of this guy Parvis. Parvis is, he understands growing up in Ukraine that the world is moved by these black paths. He understands the Chumaks, the Chumaki, as they're called, the people who deliver the grain to the Black Sea, have been doing so for thousands of years. He learns these stories when he's a young man. Many Jews, as you see on the lower right here, are involved in the grain trade, and they make this trade possible. And he's in a grain trading family, and so he understands how this grain trade works. It's in the 1860s that major ports begin to use nitroglycerin to blast and create deeper ports. Antwerp, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Liverpool, London, all of them use dynamite to deepen their ports. And by the 1860s, as the United States moves into the grain trade, there are something like 3 to 4 bushels of grain for every person living west of the Rhine that's delivered across the Atlantic Ocean every year. And it's feeding all of the major cities in Europe. Why does Parvis, Parvis does not like the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire is, he's Jewish. The Russian Empire is sponsoring pogroms against Jews in Odessa, which he and his family had experienced. They see the Russian Empire as brutal. And it's in the period of his sort of discovery of this transformation that he becomes a communist. And the reason that you might have heard about, as the port of Chicago increasingly replaces the port of Odessa as being the central grain port in the world. And this, on the map, on this image on the right, gives you a sense of the United States grain exports, which are sort of shockingly high from the Civil War forward. And I tell the story in the book about how this happens, and the explanation for this is the Civil War. Basically, Peter Watson, another person you've never heard of, is the Assistant Secretary of War. He is the person who faces a food crisis in Chattanooga in 1862, and he promises the four railway barons that they can build 4 competing railways from Chicago to New York. This is the New York Central, the Erie, the Pennsylvania, and the Baltimore, Ohio. He helped set up a futures market in Chicago by having a colonel in the Union Army telegraph orders for oats initially from New York to Chicago, and those oats are delivered in large quantities to feed the Union Army. And this is what basically saves the army in Chattanooga, becomes the basis for U.S. Grant's Cracker Line. The wartime delivery of food, I argue, is crucial for understanding Union victory in the war after 1863. Feeding the troops in Chattanooga makes Sherman's march to the sea possible. Sherman's men don't cut themselves off from supply lines, as most people argue. They, in fact, are fed over a very long distance supply line that runs from Jeffersonville, Indiana, or Louisville, all the way to first to Chattanooga and then to Atlanta. They receive double rations the whole time that they're traveling. It's a railway corridor that's defended by Black men and women who are lining and relining track. It's there are soldiers stationed at every mile along this railway corridor to block guerrillas. Mayors of southern towns are shipped back and forth along the railway to prevent people from attacking these supply lines. During the Civil War, this is very powerful, and it makes possible a kind of Union advance into enemy territory, particularly in North Georgia, which doesn't have enough food to feed an army of over 100,000 men. After the war, though, it's these places that pour a tremendous amount of grain into the Atlantic for the rest of the world. The US, of course, during the war, the Union Army needs foreign exchange, and the foreign exchange that had previously come from cotton is gone because of the blockade of the South. And in response, the Union Army delivers grain in massive quantities. So back to Parvis. Parvis sees this transformation. He sees Russia's weakness in its dependence on the grain trade. And he basically lays out a framework for bringing revolution to Russia by blocking off its grain ports in international context. And he does this in World War I. He defends Turkey, which blocks France and Britain from getting grain from Russia. He helped set up the artillery at Istanbul and Gallipoli, which stop the Allied powers against the Axis powers. And then finally, the reason you might have heard of Parvis is that Parvis persuades the German central government, which is in trouble in 1914, that he can provide them with grain if they need it, 1915. And all they have to do is give them 50 million Deutschmarks, and between 10 and 50 million Deutschmarks, and he will provide Russian grain delivered on the Baltic. So bear with me here for a second. So the Baltic Sea, grain from Russia and Ukraine is already waiting in silos in the Baltic. He will establish a grain trading post at Denmark and provide grain to the German army, which is starving. In return, Germany will send a sealed train of Bolsheviks and Mensheviks to the Union Station in Petersburg to start the revolution. Germany gets its grain, Russia gets the Russian Revolution. And this is his plan for revolutionizing Russia, which is tremendously successful. And Parvis's role in this has been discussed by a lot of people, but they tend to see it as a kind of story of the Jewish communist millionaire. The Nazis, for example, talk about him this way. But I would argue it's really understanding these black paths, understanding logistics that help us understand kind of how the world is organized by trade, and has been organized since before writing by our kind of international trade in food and the weaknesses of empires, because they rest on these convergent places of food. They depend on them. And if you mess with the food for empires, empires can crumble in an instant. And he understands that about the Russian Empire, and he revolutionizes Russia for that reason. And this is Parvis with Rosa Luxemburg. I found out about him because I was reading Rosa Luxemburg's letters, and she said everything I learned about the mass strike, he's there in the center, she's down there on the left. Rosa Luxemburg says, everything I learned about the international economy and the mass strike, I learned from Parvis, and I didn't know who this was. And I discovered that Parvis was kind of making a similar case about food, Panic of 1873, the American Civil War, and international trade. Parvis here tried to start a revolution in 1905. To his right is Leon Trotsky, his closest associate, and the two of them unsuccessfully create the first Soviet in Petersburg. They try to start a revolution. They're captured by the Tsar. They are slated for execution. But Parvis, always thinking one step ahead, has already put diamonds in the soles of his shoes, and he uses the diamonds in the soles of his shoes to bribe the guards to escape. It's in World War I that he goes to Turkey and sets up this model for revolution in Russia. He learns about the model for the Russian Revolution from Turkey, and the Turkish Revolution that is ultimately the model for the Russian Revolution. And no one in Russia knows this, no one in Turkey knows this, but Parvis knows it and Trotsky know it, that there's a way of creating a new kind of army that will be educated in the army itself. And this is what the Young Turks do in Russia in Turkey in 1909. And Trotsky takes over the Red Army in 1918 and 1919 and does the same thing. He travels with propaganda, history of Russia. He teaches soldiers, basically learn to read within the Red Army, and they're promoted to officers. And this Red Army becomes just as powerful and just as important, and indeed more powerful and more important than the Turkish army does. And the Turkish army had initially done this in 1911 and 1912. Okay. And so if we were going to talk about what revolutionizes Russia, a large part of that story is the story of oceans of grain, story about an international competition between Russia and the United States for the European market for grain. It's this European market for grain, I argue, that makes it possible for Europe to industrialize, because it has cheap food in cities for the first time. From 1868 to 1872, food prices are cut in half. And it's the biggest drop in the price of food ever. And it stays that way from 1872 forward. Grain prices drop and they never go back up again. And that's entirely because of the United States and this international market for grain, the competition between the United States and Russia for that market. Yeah, and this is the commissar, People's Commissar train that Trotsky operated, that he used to kind of revolutionize Russian society. And this is where we are today. The sort of understanding of the power of Ukraine, the power of its wheat, the power of those international markets is something that Putin understands absolutely. And he says that there's no such thing as Ukraine, that Ukraine wouldn't exist without Russia. But Ukrainians do know this. They understand the power and importance of this. Russia is the world's biggest grain exporter today. Ukraine is the fifth. And they are in direct competition for this international trade. The place where their grain goes is the place where that grain, bear with me here for a second, is the range of the old Byzantine Empire, which is the Mediterranean Sea and all the way across to the Strait of Gibraltar is between Spain and Morocco. That was called the Strait of Hercules back in the time of the Byzantine Empire. There's another strait, which is probably the Strait of Hormuz, which is in the Middle East. That was the extent of the Byzantine Empire in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 8th, 11th, 13th century. And those are the places now that are facing a grain shortage as this war has emerged in Russia. So understanding the kind of geopolitics, understanding the American emergence as a kind of international power, all of it depends, I argue in the book, on oceans of grain. Thanks. Sorry, I can't hear you, Virginia.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Wow, gosh, thank you so much for that. That is a lot of information to take in, but so fascinating and so relevant. So I'm going to turn it over to anybody that might have questions. I'm sure there are plenty. Let's see.
Hi, thank you so much, Scott. That was so great to hear. And honestly, it's so great to hear before. I don't know if everybody knows this, but Scott's going to be one of our, actually, he's going to be our very first actual interviewee for the documentary on Tuesday. He's going to be the very first out of the 7 that we're doing in 2 days. And so this is a great prep. But the main question I was wondering the whole time we were talking, and it's all fascinating, but as a labor historian, as a seasoned historian, why do you think this has been left out? Like, I mean, this is kind of mind blowing to me, and everything's always so focused on cotton, and the history of capitalism is always so hyper focused on cotton. Why is it just the connection to slavery, and that way it kind of leaves out a lot of labor history that we don't usually talk about? Or why do you think it hasn't been brought up before now?
It's a great question. Part of it is, well, there's a bunch of reasons why cotton has been the focus. One thing is that if you look at the census, it looks like, historical statistics of the United States, it looks like the US is not exporting grain until the Civil War. But actually, if you go back to the Treasury reports, which I did, the US's biggest export all the way up until the Panic of 1819 is grain. But it was not recorded in a way that made it easy to show up from the Treasury records to the historical statistics. And so there was more grain that was being exported from the United States than there was cotton until the Panic of 1819. And the Panic of 1819 basically, Great Britain blocks grain. It creates what we call the Corn Acts, gosh, what is it called? It's basically to block foreign grain from coming into Great Britain, and once it does that, in a kind of complicated system, the United States can no longer export grain, And so I argue that the reign of King Cotton is actually not when we think it is. It's not as long as we think it is. That it starts in 1820 and it ends in 1860, 40 years. And that's a very short period in the kind of economic history of the United States, but it's become very powerful and important for, historians of slavery and for Sven Beckert and all the other people who've talked about this, because there was a time when most foreign exchange was cotton. And then, so if you want to talk about the United States in an international economy, you had to talk about cotton. But that's partly just a weird artifact of the way in which trade materials were collected in this period. Yeah, so I mean, I actually, it makes me want to write a book called The Strange Career of King Cotton, right? The King Cotton is not this long stretch, this long period where Southern cotton dominates the international economy. It's actually just the lifetime of one person, half a lifetime of one person. So yeah, so I think that's part of it is just people aren't counting. And this has been the big complaint about the history of capitalism folks, is that there's not a lot of, they don't use a lot of numbers, and I can't resist not digging into the numbers when I see them. So that's the short answer. There are longer answers about, I think, why people think, I don't want to suggest cotton's not important. It is, and it's what the war's about, obviously, slavery and cotton. But it's surprisingly tenuous. And when the U.S. basically starts exporting grain in large quantities in 1860, it's really returning to an older system, I think. That said, most of that cotton was going to the Caribbean. So slavery is absolutely crucial to this whole story. It's this Caribbean slavery that the United States is supporting. The US's biggest market is really not the United States, it's the British Caribbean. US's biggest market is not Britain, it's the British Caribbean. And slavery on islands only works if you starve people, and you can only starve people if the food is coming from elsewhere. And so, I don't want to, in the labor historian part of me says slavery is crucial to this, but cotton is not the only story.
Right else.
Sorry, there's a bunch of.
I guess
I think everybody's collecting their thoughts.
I just want to ask about the arc. So like I read Iron Confederacies. This is the first book of yours that I read. Steel Driving Man. Like,
oh my gosh, right.
We get the Nation of Deadbeats. How have you evolved over the track of these different books, and like how does your latest book reflect the work that's come before?
So that's a great question. So part of it is so somebody was a friend of mine who's an English professor at William & Mary said that he wrote an NEH application and he didn't get it, and the external review was, every time this guy comes to a river he changes horses. And that's a little bit what this sounds like, right? Is I can't stay on a single topic. So let me start at the very beginning. So my honors thesis was on the iron and steel industry in Pennsylvania in the 1870s. And I was interested in the shift from anthracite to bituminous coal, the creation of sort of Carnegie's steel works, and the sort of technical and logistical things about how you deliver the iron and coke and stuff like that. And as I was reading that, it wasn't a great honors thesis. I wouldn't, but as I was reading that, I thought, nobody understands the Panic of 1873. All these American historians think they understand it. They think it's J. Cook, and they think it's, it's an American story, but they don't know that when I'm reading these financial newspapers, when I'm trying to understand, the kind of finances of this, there have been a lot of labor history about it, but I was more interested in sort of the history, what we now call history of capitalism, the relationship between capital and labor. And I said, well, this is not right. So it just kind of stuck in the back of my head. And then when I wrote Iron Confederacies, one of the ways of thinking about Iron Confederacies is I was struck by cheap wheat, that was a story that really pissed off farmers. That once the Southern Railway extends from Richmond to Atlanta, then grain from the Midwest, cheap grain from the Midwest, goes out by water and then back in to the Richmond to Atlanta corridor. And the thing that these Klansmen are mostly talking about is food prices and how food prices are dropping, and everybody's pissed off about that. Everybody's angry about that. That corn is good in the family, but you can't sell wheat anymore to the cities, and nobody can pay their taxes. The taxes are too high because of the Reconstruction governments. But the fundamental problem is that all this aid that initially came immediately after the war is making it hard for farmers to make ends meet. And the people that they blame for this are Black men who are collecting a daily wage on the railroad. And so that's partly what Iron Confederacy is about, is that story. So that's how I started. And then the John Henry book, is, my advisor said, well, you should write something about John Henry. And I said, for my dissertation, this was like a week before I was supposed to defend, and he said, no, just something else. And so then I thought, well, what does John Henry have to do with anything to do with the Southern Railway? And then I realized, oh yeah, the Southern Railway owns all the convicts, and the Southern Railway's angry because the Chesapeake and Ohio owns all the convicts in the Virginia Penitentiary. And so I backed into the John Henry story. I was not thinking that I was going to find a real John Henry. But when I dug into, I had already worked in the, Southern Railway records. I'd already worked in the Chesapeake and Ohio records. I'd already worked in the, what's it called? The Atlantic Coastline Railroad. And so I knew what they're talking about, and they're all talking about labor, and they're all angry because Huntington has all the convicts, and it's not really in the newspapers. And so John Henry was a complete surprise, and was not initially what I was intending to do. I was interested in it as a labor song, like you're setting the pace of work if you're a trackliner, and what better song to set the pace of work than one about somebody who fights against a steam drill and dies. That's where I learned about dynamite, and then I thought, oh, okay, dynamite. So we used dynamite between 1868 and 1872. You penetrate all the tunnels all the way around the world, except for the Himalayas, in this short period, in those 4 years. And then you can go around the world in 80 days, right? That book is written in 1877. And so international trade is changing because of the dynamite. So that's, like, another piece falls in. And then I was going to do something about the Panic of 1873. I was going to do Rosa Luxemburg, Sigmund Freud, Anton Chekhov, and Dwight Moody. I called them the four horsemen of the liberal apocalypse. And all critics of liberalism who are affected by the Panic of 1873 in their young lives. And then when I read the Rosa Luxemburg thing about Parvis, that Parvis explained everything she knew about the international economy, and I thought that was interesting. And then 2008 happened, right? And so 2008, I had written this article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed about. I thought everybody was talking about 1929 as 2008 was happening, and I said, no, it's more like the Panic of 1873. And then, the editor said, well, if that's true, name 5 things that might happen. And I did, and they all happened. And then so that's when all these banks started calling me in 2008, these fund managers. And first it was, analysts, and then it was fund managers calling me and saying, what, come on, tell me about wheat and steel prices. I don't understand this. How is this? Explain how this is like 1873, explain why the commodities work. And then they eventually, after a few of these weird phone calls where, literally this multimillionaires are calling me, asking me advice about the financial downturn. I said, well, why don't economists know this? And he said, this one guy that I spoke to said, they don't do financial panics. And he said, well, tell me, is there any book on the history of all the financial panics? And I thought there was, and I realized there wasn't. And so that's when I wrote Deadbeats, and then finally, after all these other detours, I got back to this thing. This big question is, what's the Panic of 1873, and how do I understand it? And Parvis was like, it blew my mind. It was like, oh, I have a totally different way of understanding the international economy. And all these world systems theorists have these kind of very fancy stories, but Parvis's story is much simpler. It's, follow the grain and you can follow the empires. If you see where the grain is cut off, you can see the empires starving. And when the empires starve, they can be revolutionized. And so what I had learned over the space of 30 years of research in all these other things then kind of fit. So that's, yeah, sorry, it's a long answer to a short question, but that's the arc, I guess, of the various books.
So I have a question. So
Yeah.
as the Port of Chicago outpaces Odessa and the US starts to take over as the feeder of the world, what does that change look like in the United States? Is there a connection to like the populist movement and government funded silos, and how does that look in the US?
Yeah, so it's so I talk about the futures market. Obviously other people have talked about the futures market, a lot of people, and I have a very different take on this than Nature's Metropolis does, who he sees it as a basically railroads meeting water. And that sounds right, but it was in these Union Army records that I discovered this Union Army that does this, and that they are the ones who initially set up the futures market. So what is it? So one of the things that I think is that U.S. export of grain gives the United States foreign exchange, and once that pathway is established, then the United States starts shipping out beef and pork. And then the United States starts shipping out canned vegetables. And the biggest export of the United States, cotton is still big because the South grows more cotton after the war than it does before the war. But after cotton, the biggest American export is manufactured food from 1870 all the way to 1910, really before World War I. And manufactured food is canned beef, tinned beef, Spam, but also canned vegetables and things like that. That's why the steel industry is important, is because you combine steel and tin to make these tin cans. That's why sugar is so important in the United States, because you need all that white sugar to preserve the vegetables and fruits in cans. And so American economic prowess as an international economy depends ultimately on first grain and then these other foods that the United States provides to the rest of the world. The populists, this is Matt's territory, so I feel awkward. Sorry, there's two Matts. The other Matt, but I would say that it tends to be that populists tended to be in places where there was a single crop, and so where the ups and downs of the economy are much more hurtful. You don't see a lot of populists in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, in part because when grain prices go up, corn prices go down. When grain and corn prices go down, beef and pork prices go up, and so farmers can feed so there's a way in which you can move on multiple crops for these other places. But the ones that depend on a single railroad, like the Richmond and Danville, the Southern Railway, like the the Kansas Pacific and places like that, where there's one railroad that's a monopolist, those places are where the populist movements are. And so I would agree with the populists that the railroads are monopolists, and they're their central problem, is that they have this kind of monopoly power in those regions, and nationalizing the railroad is the right thing as populists see it. And that's what Germany does. That's what every European state faces, this problem, and they nationalize the railroads. The United States doesn't do that. Russia does it too. They nationalize all the major railroads, and they're so powerful in the United States that doesn't happen. And that's another difference for me in the Civil War, is that I say that I'm a kind of neo-Beardian because I don't think it's Northern industrialists that are behind the Republican Party, but I do think it's what I call the boulevard barons, these people who are committed to building railway corridors to the west to sell grain to Europe. This is people like David Dowse, this is Hollis Potter Huntington, this is Forbes, John Murray Forbes. It's the Fessenden wing of the Republican Party. They fund the Secret Six, that support John Brown in West Virginia. They're the ones who send rifles to Kansas to hold off pro-slavery people in Kansas. They're really the ones who arguably are an important part of starting the war. I don't want to suggest that the abolitionist movement is very important, but people are ignoring the abolitionist movement for 30 years when it's the railway barons who say our economic livelihood depends on there being free land, non-slave holding land in Kansas and Missouri. That's when the Republican Party quickly gets organized and is supported. I think it's important that Abraham Lincoln is a railway lord, right? He's fending off involved in these fights between railroads and states over who gets the land in the West, whether the Swamp Act or whether the land grants are the most important thing. So I do think that the railroad barons are the Republican. They're the most powerful people in the Republican Party. They're extremely powerful, and breaking them, the populists, as much as they try, can't break the authority of the Republican Party, and that's a reason why I think the populist movement ultimately fails, is that you have this one party that is absolutely ineluctably bound to railroad corridors to the west.
Thank you.
I think the populist, part of the problem of the populist is it's one party and one railroad and one crop, like all those three things together. And that's where populism is the strongest. Everything's like they've got no other options because one party controls the state, one railroad serves. And of course in the South, a lot of parts of the South until the 1890s, they can't talk about regulating railroads because they're still begging for railroads.
Right. And the Southern Railway, when I was going to do Iron Confederacies, I had 9 chapters, and basically chapter 1 became the whole book. So the other chapters were going to be about how the Richmond and Danville basically chooses governors, and the Democratic governors in the South for in Georgia, South Carolina,
John Gordon in Georgia.
Right. They basically picked them, and all these letters to Alexander Boyd Andrews. Basically, they send him letters saying, "I'd love to get a free pass from the Southern Railway," and he would fold it up and put it in a little pigeonhole. And if you cross the Southern Railway, he would pull it out and publish it, and then you would be dead in politics. So they're so powerful. There's they have so much influence, these railroads, in the Republican Party in the West and the Midwest and West. And then they, also the Richmond, Danville, and others align themselves with the Bourbons ultimately in the 80s and 90s, and then just pick all the governors until World War I.
Well, that was the Alliance Democratic legislature in Georgia. It was supposed to be the great, pro-populist legislature, and John Gordon's the U.S. senator. It's kind of hard to have reform when that's your senator.
Right. Is he actually, just a quick question. Is the attorney general who's running John Gordon, is he related to that John Gordon, do you know, in Georgia?
I don't think so. That's a really common name in Georgia. I haven't heard anything about, I would think if he was, he'd be, it would have come up probably.
I see.
There is a lot of old Gordon money though in South Georgia, so who knows? But one other question that I had, that's as I get older, I think this is kind of the micro to the macro of like thinking of the fact that the technological advances that we see, as early as we do, are just astounding to me as a humanities person. Like I can't even fathom being able to come up with, being able to dynamite an entire canal, and they're doing this, but at the same time, you have millions and millions of people starving, that's kind of the still the state that we're in so many ways. But so kind of the micro question to that is, when I was thinking about your book, I was also thinking about, all the WPA slave narratives that I've read, and all the
Yeah.
everything that talks about food waste always talks about the fact that they never had access to flour, that they never had access to non-corn bread. And like the first time that they taste anything that's flour is such a powerful food
Huh.
memory for these people. And
Wow.
so how are the slaveholders just constantly, it's just completely a classist thing as far as you know, or how is that done?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, so people tell me that, you know, they couldn't have grown wheat in Georgia, and I and I know that they did, right? And but yeah, it was a kind of, it tended to be elite thing. Biscuits, of course, are a post-Civil War thing, because biscuits are cheap. But yeah, I think you know, there were plenty of flour mills throughout, you know, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, and places like that in that early period. I think there were, you couldn't get much. So when you ground up wheat in these old flour mills, though, you got very little white flour. It's just a tiny amount of white flour. And so that you would use that to make cookies, maybe, or to make, but you'd use that to make very little bread. But you could make very, very little bread with a lot of wheat. A lot of it was the middlings, the kind of germ and bran and stuff like that. And that went in, some of that went into biscuit. Biscuit was a kind of wheat, actually, a really brown wheat that people used to make biscuit. So now our biscuits are white bread, basically. But then the biscuit was a kind of a brownish, you know, tinge and stuff like that. And then the rest you fed to animals. And so that might have gone into like slop pens or something like that. So white bread is, up until, you know, 1870 or so, is something that only very rich people ate. There's this new myth, what's called the Hungarian milling method. So the old mills were like this, where they ground the grain on the millstone, and it, you know, kind of poured out, and you got all this, the white flour and the brown flour all mixed together. In this new Hungarian method, there are these little, what are they? They're glass or steel rollers, and they just very gently pop the grain. They get smaller and smaller over time. And when you do that, it produces all this dust. You collect all the dust, and that becomes your white flour. And everything that drops down to the bottom becomes the middlings and stuff like that. And so you can get like much more white flour out of this. And that's when people's diets shift, is the 70s, to white. So white bread is not something that just rich people have. Just, I mean, in Austria, it was the king that had, you know, white bread, and everybody else got brown bread, or you know, this other stuff. White bread is a really an 1870s invention on a mass scale. Yeah, part of about the poverty thing. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about Europe and is interesting, and Marx understood this, and others, is that famine goes away in Europe in this period, and that's partly because of all this food. And heights go up eventually by the 1880s and 1890s, because families can, because of the price of bread goes down, people can spend money on other things for their families, and particularly babies and infants. And so long term, you know, if we're looking at thousands of people together, we see heights go up for the first time in Europe after over 1,000 years. And so this futures market is, you know, some people benefit, the populists don't like it, other people don't like it, but workers actually benefit by this cheap flour. And, you know, our grandparents, you know, they were the ones who benefited by this transformation. And it's you know, not unimportant. It's really the fact that, you know, workers were always shorter and always poorer, and they always died earlier. up until the 1870s. And then it starts to change when all this food comes from the United States. And so mine is a little bit more of a positive story. Usually when people talk about the US and food, it's about food aid, and it's about Guatemala, and it's about, dictatorships all over the place. This is a slightly different story because the United States is basically selling this grain kind of in international markets, and it's the cheapness of it is beneficial to workers.
Well, that's kind of why the populist sub-treasury plan never really got off the ground with, the whole, I spent the whole first book trying to figure out why labor simply support populists, and it was because they were afraid to raise the price of food.
Right. They were in favor of raising the price of food.
Yeah, that's what the workers said. And why should I support the populists? They want to raise the price of my food.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And it's still to this day, the American household budget is like 13% for food, and it's 40% in North Africa. It's 35% in Russia. It's a really big difference. Part of the whole American mass market for iPhones and stuff like that has a lot to do with the fact that we have the cheapest food in the world.
Subsidized corn too, though, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing, is that corn, it sounded like a good idea, I suppose, to not be energy dependent on Middle Eastern oil, but the shift from wheat to corn meant that Russia became the world supplier of wheat. And that's a little bit of the situation that we're in now, where the rest of the world depends on this Russian wheat. It's not that easy to shift back from corn to wheat, since farmers are so dependent on this ethanol subsidies and stuff like that.
That's the perfect segue, because I was going to ask, as we wrap it up, particularly so we all sound more intellectual and worldly at our next dinner parties or whatever. What are your kind of connections or takeaways between what's going on now? And learned a lot about, Odessa and Ukraine tonight, which I think all of us, knew that,
Right.
that this was that, Ukraine's like the breadbasket of the world, but
Right.
But how would you kind of put that? What is your kind of analysis about what's going on?
So this has been so strange, because the book came out February 22nd, and Putin invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2 days later. And I didn't remember this, but other people on Twitter did. At the beginning and the end of the book, I say Russia will never be a world power without Ukraine, and that Russian GDP is the same as Italy's, and unless Russia is able to, have Ukraine, that Russia will never be a world power. And when I wrote that, I was thinking, economic power. I wasn't really thinking about. I wrote it in 2021. I wasn't really thinking about, the invasion of Ukraine for this. So I think, geopolitics is all about resources. Has a lot to do with resources, and there's a platinum, palladium, and all these other sorts of things in the Donbas region. They found all this liquid natural gas in Crimea, like right before Russia took it. But I think the fact that Russia and the United and Ukraine are now competitors, and the weird thing about that is that as long as Russia's got no reason to stop this war, because as long as Ukraine can't get they have 150 million metric tons of grain waiting to go to Egypt and Morocco and South Korea and all these other sorts of places. And as long as that grain is blocked, grain prices are doubled. So we go from 5 cents, 50 cents a bushel, 5 cents a bushel, sorry, to 10 cents a bushel, which is, I'm sorry, $5 a bushel to $13, $11 or $13 a bushel. And so as long as Ukraine is blocked, as long as it's blockaded, Russia doubles its take on the grain exports. So Russia's got no reason to slow this down, no reason to stop this war, because it continues to benefit from the blockade of Ukraine. So that's not obvious to a lot of people. So we think, well, when's the war going to stop? Putin's going to wait until the end of the season, until the end of the summer, because all the Russian grain is going out and none of the Ukrainian grain is going out. 150 million metric tons is massive. It's like 1/5 of the world's traded grain. So that's one thing. The other is every time we see grain prices, right? Every time we see grain prices go up, we see conflict. So that's the French Revolution, let them eat cake. That's the Russian Revolution, the blocking of Ukrainian grain to Russia, and Petersburg and Moscow is really important for understanding how the Bolsheviks won. It is that the Bolsheviks blocked the grain that was coming from Ukraine to Russia. And people had to try to carry it in person, and the tying up of those markets was crucial to Bolshevik victory in 1917. It's the revolutions of 1848 have everything to do with the price of food going up when the potato famine strikes. It doesn't just strike Ireland, it strikes all of Europe. And wheat prices go up, farmers can't get access to potatoes because the potatoes are dying on the vine. And free trade as a result of that, the abolition of the corn laws in Europe and the UK is everything to do with the potato famine. And so basically these empires and states are incredibly fragile, dependent on this food, and we don't see it. It's hard to see it, and they'll never let you know that. But that's a crucial part of understanding it. So there was a drought in Russia and Ukraine in 2011. There were forest fires. And Russia's response was to blockade, was to basically block the export of grain. And Arab Spring was the direct result. Arab Spring, because prices of food doubled in Syria, in basically most of North Africa, Morocco, and all this stuff. So Arab Spring, all those places were places that were importing Russian grain, and where suddenly the prices rose up so much. And there were food riots in those cities that led to Arab Spring. And so the Syrian crisis has everything to do with food, everything to do with Russian and Ukrainian food. So where we are now is that was a high price. That was $8 a barrel for $8 a bushel. So it went from, the average is $4 or $5 a bushel. It went to $8 a bushel. That was Arab Spring. Now we're at $11 a bushel. And so the next 5 or 6 months, there's going to be chaos in much of the Middle East and North Africa, and even potentially places like South Korea. South Korea depends on imported grain that mostly comes from Ukraine. And it's a short window. So the only place that could have responded to this grain was North Dakota and Canada. When they learned that grain prices doubled, the only countries that could grow grain could plant in February and March to harvest in June. That's the only place you can do that in the world, is North Dakota and Canada. So nobody can respond to this in time for the summer. And so anyways, so that's where we are, is revolution and violence. And it's not famine. I mean, famine is going to happen, but famine is not the thing. It's when you can't feed your kids that you're going to go in the streets and you're going to fight. And that's when people bring out tanks like they did in Arab Spring.
Wow.
Sorry.
No.
Bummer.
No, but so the interconnectedness of it all is not something that we always see when we're watching the news every evening.
Yeah, so this is the funny thing too, is that I've been on the news in South Korea, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, on the 6 o'clock news in those places, in Denmark, South Korea, the Netherlands. 27 million viewers in South Korea. I've been on all these shows outside the country because they are very aware of this grain issue, but nowhere in the United States, because in part because U.S. news is all red team versus blue team, so they don't actually want to, well, I was on the CBC with the deputy director of the FAO and the chief economist for the USDA, and there's a bunch of experts talking about what's going on. And so I learned more about what was happening just being on the show with these other people who are experts in, international grain. So I've learned a ton since the book came out about what's going on and what's likely to happen. But yeah, the U.S., I had a piece in Time magazine. I had a, Financial Times and Wall Street Journal both reviewed the book very positively. I was in the Spectator, which is like the British version of Time magazine. I was on BBC News, but if you watch the U.S. news, it's nobody much knows about this. But farmers watch the news in those other places, and that's been this peculiar thing, is that I don't really have that much time. This is like the 18th thing that I've done about the book since it came out, and most of it is news shows. So
somebody alert the North Dakotans.
what's that?
Somebody alert the North Dakotans that they need to get going.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
Well, and thank you so much for taking the time
Thanks.
out of your busy schedule to talk to us. This was so fascinating.
It's so great to talk to like Civil War people too, because I feel like I've been, it's like, what's the third most important port on the Black Sea? That's the important grain exporting port in the Black Sea. Your expertise is like, suddenly people care about it in a way that nobody. My kids were like driving me crazy because I took them to every major deep port in Europe, and like now it's important. So.
Well, thank you so much, and
Thanks.
Thank you everybody for tuning in tonight. We will see you in September, but again, we will be in touch with you over the summer and sending out scholar interviews over the summer. So we
Sounds
will
exciting.
see you later.
Yes.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Virginia. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Scott.